Alcor is pleased to welcome you all to today's webinar. Founded in 2008 and headquartered in California, Alcor is a global cloud advisory and implementation services company serving Fortune 500, government agencies, and other leading organizations in multiple industry verticals across the Americas, Canada, and India. Alcor is a ServiceNow Gold Services partner and also partners with Salesforce, FireEye, Microsoft, and Bomgar. We advise leading businesses on cloud platforms, architecture, enterprise service management, and integrating IT service delivery. We also provide business process consulting to capture, re-engineer, and improve processes that can easily be automated to deliver real value. The Alcor consulting team has in-depth expertise in business strategy, cloud technology, and organizational change management. Our ongoing webinar series is designed to inform, enlighten, and start discussions within your own organizations. If you require any additional information after listening to today's webinar, please reach out to us through our website, www.alcortech.com. Today's webinar is also on social media. You can follow, comment, and get regular updates for today's webinar with the hashtag AlcorWebinar. That's hashtag or number sign ALCORWEBINAR. We have time reserved at the end of the webinar for Q&A, so please feel free to type any questions into the questions section. Today's webinar topic is Right Size Your GRC Implementation, presented by Karina Klever and Marcus Lamb. Karina is a client partner with Alcor Solutions and has an extensive background in operational risk, risk management, risk assessment and controls development, program management, process development, operational development, and maturing organizations both globally and locally. She has over 15 years of program and project management experience with enterprise-wide global regulated implementations and is a forward-thinking, creative, and innovative leader with extensive experience designing, building, and aligning IT solutions that integrate business and technology while enabling business strategies and dramatically improving performance. We also have Marcus Lamb from ServiceNow to provide additional commentary as needed. I will now turn the webinar over to Karina and Marcus.
Thank you everyone for joining. I'm Karina, and a quick hint into what we're going to be talking about today. A lot of folks are making sure that they're implementing their GRC program correctly. And so we're here to provide a little bit of guidance and structure to some approaches that we've discovered that may really help things. So we're going to go ahead and start really to take a look at what our GRC program ought to look like with the governing regulations. And the assumption we're making here is that you know what those are because you know what your business is. And so our governing regulations really are going to be leading us to publish policies, processes, and standards internal to our company. So our policies, processes, and standards really are the things that we want our operations and our departments to adhere to inside our company. And these are the rules that we want to associate to our GRC program and within our GRC program. Once we've published those out, we're going to go ahead and check to make sure that we're applying and adhering those policies internally. And we're going to put some controls around them. They're going to be time-based and cyclical. We want to make sure that they're appropriate organizationally and functionally, and that we really get some good improvement cycles out of them as we continue to do those verification checks. Once we do them, we're going to have some results that are going to come out that are going to lead to some reports that are going to show successes or remediation plans that might be necessary, and we're going to continue to develop those and build on those until the auditors come in And when the auditors come in, they're going to want to see some of those reports, and we're going to hand those reports over to them, and they're going to go away and do a few assessments and figure out where they think we could be improving things or not. And they're going to be giving us a report card that we're going to use to go ahead and feed back into our governing regulations and our policies, processes, and standards. So really, this is the cycle at a very, very high level of how we want to run our GRC program. And eventually, what we do want to get to is having those exceptional audit results. So we're going to take a look at our starting point at the next slide, which is our governing regulations. And you know, there's a lot of them out there. There's actually 440 regulatory agencies in the Federal Register. And this can get really, really in-depth. If you're in the healthcare space, you're going to have HIPAA, HITECH, ONC, CMS as just some of the regulations that you have to adhere to. You know, HIPAA also gives us PHI controls and guidance for protected health information, EDI for electronic data interchange, which is really mostly used for claims processing. HITECH gives us EHR, which is guidance for electronic health record management, and HIT, anybody in the healthcare industry knows what a big initiative that is to expand and adopt nationally. If you're in the pharma space, of course, you're regulated by the FDA. And so FDA gives us Title 21 of CFR, and obviously Part 11 gives us regulations that tell us how to process electronic records and signatures, and GMP is used for as good manufacturing practices standards across really any pharma company out there. If you're at a bank, you have FDIC and then the former OTS, the CFPB and the FTC, Basel III, if you're an international bank. And of course, FDIC gives us guidance using FFIEC, which is the Federal Financial Institution Examination Council, which is really the principal set of rules and regulations used by federal agencies for banks and banking. So if you're a publicly traded company, there's Sarbanes-Oxley. A very familiar section is 404 that a lot of us use to go ahead and have the internal controls for financial reporting. And then if you process credit cards, PCI DSS, really depending on your level, you may be required to build out a segregated network or set of systems within your infrastructure to hold credit card data information. Right, so the lowest level is level 4. That means you have less than 20,000 transactions annually, but up to $1 million in value. And the highest level is level 1, which is where you have over $6 million in annual transactions. You may actually also be at a company that has a combination of some of these regulations. So you almost have to pick and choose really what applies to you. So we're going to go ahead and look at an example company at the next slide. We're going to basically say that we know that our regulation is Sarbanes-Oxley because we're publicly traded, and let's say we're a retail bank. So we have credit card transactions that actually flow through our environment. So the first thing we need to do is determine really what's applicable to us in the regulation, and this is where we start some of that right sizing. We looked at a bunch of different regulations on the previous screen, and now we have to say what applies to us in our company. So if we take a look at the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, it can actually drop far off the screen. We could probably hone in on Title IV, which is basically some of the controls, most of the controls that we use in IT as an example, and specifically Section 404 is the one we talked about at the last slide. But now that we know what really applies to us in the regulation, we have to figure out what framework do we want to use to gain compliance within our organization. And this is where a lot of the confusion starts. There's a lot of frameworks out there that are written by some super smart people, and they're very, very informative. There's just so many of them. We have a really hard time to know which framework works best for me and my company? And do I really have to use all of it? So really what we're trying to get to at the end of all of this is to publish those policies, processes, and standards so that we can give our company guidelines for how to operationally act daily so that we know what our own rules are inside our companies and we can figure out where we're out of compliance before we fall out of compliance with those rules. So let's take a look at some of the overlapping framework that we have. We're going to start with COBIT. COBIT, one of my most favorite frameworks, very well used in very, very many industries. And let's put a dot on the map and say we want that control particular to our system, which actually sits inside the Build, Acquire, and Implement section of COBIT 5. Well, the Build, Acquire, and Implement section actually has 10 subsections. And within those 10 subsections, there are more controls that actually are advised to be adherent to. Well, not only that, this one control also resides inside the CMMI framework. Obviously, all of us want to get to a really high level of maturity in CMMI. So you're going to find that same control in that framework and in ITIL version 3, as well as ISO 20000. And then for anybody in the project management space, the same control is going to be found inside Prince 2 and PMBOK. So this is COBIT 5. And now that we've looked at that and are understanding how that same control can appear in so many different frameworks, let's take a look at NIST. And really what's on the screen right now is a very common access control provision or guideline that says, hey, you have to manage access within your environment. Again, found in a bunch of different frameworks. And on the very right-hand side, NIST has actually been kind enough to associate for us the actual additional methodologies that show the same control we're looking at. So as you can see, for remote access management, we've got 3 controls for COBIT 5, 3 controls for ISO, 3 controls for ISO 27000, and an additional 3 controls within the NIST framework. So really, what we've discovered is many of the same recommendations and requirements appear in all of these different frameworks. And so really, we need to determine what's appropriate for us in our organization, and here's why that becomes really important. Let's take a look at a process owner, and this process owner is actually the wonderful lady who's worked super, super hard to make sure that remote access management is very well controlled inside her organization. And so if we were to use all of the frameworks with the one process owner, we'd ask her, is the remote access being managed? And she would say, it sure is. But then because there's another control in COBIT, we'd have to ask her again, is remote access being managed? To which she'd say, well, yeah, it is. But since there's another control out there in COBIT asking the same question, she'd say, it sure is. It's being managed really well inside my environment. If we as a company decide that we're also going to apply ISO 27000 standards, we have to ask this process owner one more time, is remote access being managed? And she'd say, yes, it is, but hey, there's another ISO control out there that's going to ask again the same question, to which it's not going to be that much of a great answer anymore. We've only asked this question 5 times, but you get the gist. We can continue to ask this until all 11 controls from all of the different frameworks are asked. And we don't want to waste her time very much to keep asking her the same question again and again and again. So really the question is, how do we know what's applicable to our company with all of these frameworks and regulations out there? So we have a lot to pick from. We have COBIT 5, which is a very thorough framework. We have the NIST guidelines, which is very heavily used in cybersecurity and the information security space. Great set of controls. Again, super smart people have written these. COSO cubes, very big, obviously for managing many, many parts of your operations. ISO standards are used very heavily in the information security space also. Of course, one of my favorites is ITIL. I got ITIL practitioner certified way back in 01, and I've been continuing to refine those skills. And with all of those frameworks out there, really we have to say, what works for me? And how do I pick the one that's really applicable? So you have a few options. You can definitely go through all of the available frameworks and figure out how to eliminate the redundancy. You can call Alcor. We can help you navigate through that maze a little bit. So what we're going to try to do is guide you in figuring out what's right-sized for your company, looking at all of the departments, all of your assets, your peripherals, your storage, your network, and anything else really that you have inside your company. And we can overlay those processes that we started with. We can develop the processes by overlaying your governing regulations and the frameworks so that we can get to those exceptional audit reports. So now that we've looked at all of this, we're going to kind of start introducing the tool a little bit, and the tool being ServiceNow. We are a gold partner of ServiceNow, so we want to make sure that we're understanding a few critical things. Some of the critical things is terminology. So there's a bit of a difference in terminology, which tends to cause a little bit of confusion. And we're going to walk through this really slowly so that everyone can center in where we are in the tool and how that applies to that outside world that feeds us those regulations and all of those frameworks that we can leverage. So we're going to start with something called authority documents, and in the system, authority documents are supported by citations. This is your overlap of your regulation and your framework. You need to start here. Word of caution is that the word citation is used in the system over and over again, but those in the audit space and the GRC space know citations as controls. Those are actually the things that we're managing against inside our environment. The system uses controls in a completely different way. We're going to get to that in a minute. But just so that you understand the positioning, authority documents and citations in the system are really your regulations and your framework. So let's pretend we've done that work and we've figured out what we need from a regulatory perspective and which controls we need. We're going to go ahead and load them in. From there, we're going to derive our policies. Our policies in the system are supported by something called policy statements. So these are specific company rules that the company adheres to. So these are the ones that you've deemed necessary within your organization and within your company, and you've determined that as a business owner, I want to make sure that I'm tracking to the following rules in my environment. And that's what this really is. The system then takes citations plus policy statements and works towards profile types. Profile types are those things you want to manage in your environment. Again, pretty nebulous because the system is written to not only be applicable to the small company that may have 2 policies, it's also actually applicable and scalable enough for that company that's global and heavily regulated and has tens and tens of thousands of users. So really defining those profile types is another place where Alcor can help, because you want to determine which part of my environment really do my authority documents and policies apply to. So now we're going to see the connection between the citation, the policy statement, and the profile types And that is what the system is going to call controls. So again, to stop here, ServiceNow controls are really a derivative of authority documents and policies that we've loaded in. We've overlaid that with profile types, and now we have what ServiceNow calls control. This is really important to make sure you remember because this causes confusion. Some people tend to want to go straight to what they know as controls in their head instead of loading up those citations. Just it's a terminology thing. Controls will provide for us attestations that are going to be mapped against your profile types. It's going to give us test templates that are going to be mapped against your profile types. It's going to give us audit checks that are going to be mapped to your profile types. And then it's also going to give us indicators and risk. So this is a lot of content to go through. So I want to make sure that we kind of level set. The prominent yellow is mostly what we're going to be able to talk about during this webinar. There's a lot of information to go through. The things that come out of the ServiceNow control really requires a lot more detail and probably a separate webinar by itself. So we're going to take this content and we're going to really use it to look at some of the following slides, and we're going to go through section by section. We're going to talk about authority documents, policies, profile types, and the ServiceNow controls. So if we start with authority documents, let's say we've gone through all of that work and we've determined what regulation applies to us and which frameworks apply to us. We're going to go ahead and load in those authority documents. In ServiceNow, this is where to find it. On the left-hand side, there's a few different entry points into this authority documents. But word of caution, they can be frameworks or regulations. Try to not have too many, because as we continue to drill down into the contents of each one of these, it's going to exponentially grow. So frameworks are only meant as a guide. Use only the sections applicable to you. Using the entire framework is not necessary. As you load in your authority documents, think about the controls, which the system calls citations, that are going to be used in support of your regulation. And do your best to remove redundancy here. So let's say we've loaded up our authority documents. Now we're ready to go ahead and load in our citations. So authority documents actually can be uploaded systemically. There are tools out there that can help you do that. They can be entered manually. Cautionary citation again, right? So these are basically controls we're looking at in the screen within the PCI and the COBIT frameworks. So PCI being a regulation and COBIT being a framework. So because we are using an uploaded data set for this particular set of screenshots, there's a lot of them. So PCI is showing 423 citations and COBIT is showing 270. That is significantly more than what you need. There's duplicates in here. There's redundancies, and the citations you loaded in under PCI is going to have some of the same exact citations within COBIT. So what you have to do before you proceed from this step is really to remove any of those redundancies and be super careful about them, because you're just starting the setup. So you want to make sure to look at them very carefully. So now we have our authority documents and citations, and we're going to move on to policies. Remember, policies are those rules that you want your company to actually adhere to. So what's important in policies is that sometimes you don't know which ones to put in. You don't really know how to structure the documentation set, and you don't really know what you're really wanting to look out for. So because we just went through this exercise of defining our authority documents and citations, what we want to do is we want to look at the citations we have and try to sort through them. And if you haven't done this part yet, maybe you're working off of a spreadsheet, maybe you're going to tag on to some words. So let's say the word access is something we're really concerned about at our company. Well, you want to take anything related to access, probably put it into an information security policy that's going to actually be applicable to your whole entire organization. Well, let's say we've got the information security policies, but then we find, oh, I've got some change controls that I also definitely want to include as part of my policy statements for my company. Well, that's probably going to feed into your change management policy. As you go through this exercise of looking at your authority documents and your citations, you're going to start developing a whole bunch of different policies out there. The one thing you have to remember as you document these, you can cross-reference them. I'm going to stop here for a minute and really stress the importance of this. Data retention, acceptable use, information security, business continuity, and change management probably all have a reference to access control. But you can put it in your information security policy and say, inside your business continuity policy, for access control, go see information security policy. For access control within change management, go see your information security policy. For access control within your acceptable use policy, go see the information security policy. It's really important to not create extra work for yourself by continuing to put in some of the same policy and policy statements across all of your policies. That way, when you go to update, it's actually a smaller set of data that you're updating as you go along. So now, let's say we've gone through this exercise and we know all of the policies that are applicable to us. We're going to start loading them into the system. Again, just like authority documents and citations, we're going to load them in. And here our example is the facility management policy, and we're going to see we have 14 policy statements as part of that policy. So two important things to note is that this policy is going to be made publicly available via a knowledge base article for your end users to see. Once the policy has been approved, you can actually set approvers for your policy that are going to go ahead and own keeping these policies current long-term. So now that we have our facility management policy and policy statements actually in the system, let's take an example at a particular policy statements and see how that ties back to the map that we've been navigating. When we click in that particular policy statement, this is the opportunity to take that exact policy statement and map it back to our citation that we've already previously put in the last step. So this is our connection of the citation plus the policy statement. So again, we're building on continuing to grow our GRC program here in our company. So now that we've looked at that, let's talk about profile types. Profile types are really important. Sometimes you need a little bit of help to kind of get through them. Again, the system is really fluid and it can really scale to a whole bunch of different companies and company sizes. So it's really up to you to say, do I want my entire business system to adhere to this policy that we've established? Do I just want a department? Do I want only vendors? Do I want one particular database only because I know that, for instance, that's where my general ledger data sits? So as soon as that's actually decided on, we're going to go ahead and load in our profile types. So our profile types in this example is going to be vendors. And looking around on the screen, we see a few different tabs on the bottom. And this is where we're going to start to understand how this is all connecting to the map that we established on the previous slide. Our citation is over here. We did that back when we were loading the authority documents. Our policy statement is over here. We did that when we loaded up all of our policies. Obviously, the profile type we know is we want to make sure that our vendors are adhering to our rules that are mapping back to those regulations and those frameworks that we established. The equals here is pretty fun because we're asking the system to create controls for us, which is pretty easy because the system can now derive those inputs from your citations, policy statements, and profile types and give you your 78 controls. And this is really what is going to perform some of that automation that we're looking for as we go through this whole GRC cycle, and we're having the system work for us on our behalf when we know what our ServiceNow controls are. So now let's talk about those ServiceNow controls that we've established. We're going to go into one of our controls, and we're going to go ahead and notice that life cycle across the top of the screen. The life cycle is really, really important because that's where those steps come in on how that control is managed long-term, either by the system or by the folks that are working on the systems. Or maybe you have a process like change management where you have a control that says, I want to make sure all of my changes are approved by a VP or higher, as an example. Let's say that's one of the rules, the policies inside your company. You can take that rule and apply it towards a change management process. And then when that auditor comes in, you can press a button and say, here you go, auditor, here's our rule, and here's how our changes have been adhering to that rule. We want to measure compliance against those controls. Let's take a look at the sections in that life cycle. So now that we have our control, the attestations and the test templates are going to reside in that first piece of that life cycle. So attestations are your surveys. They show what's been done and what hasn't. And your test templates are actually controlled tests with instructions on what am I testing for. So if I'm a process owner and I receive this test template, I'm going to have the opportunity to say, well, you know, in my area, this is what you're actually testing for. So those are both in the attest section of the life cycle. The next part we're going to look at is the review. So the audit piece utilizes effective and ineffective criteria for the controls that we've established. So usually this is the stuff that you want to give to the auditors. Your indicators can be set up once the prior three have been established. So the indicators is where it gets really good, because the indicators you can actually set to run themselves. They can be time-based. You can say, hey, I want to check this, you know, every week, every month, every quarter, every day. So those are in the review section. And once you've established all of that, you now get to your risk part, which is in your monitor part of the life cycle. So your monitor is your long-term. This is how this is going to run forever. You've set that up, and of course it can be edited, but you want the system to work for you again and establish that monitoring phase so that it can just execute for you, and you take a look at your results in the risk section. So that's the last life cycle step. So I think now's a good spot to go ahead and review really where we want to be. We just talked about governing regulations, the governing regulations that apply to you. We've talked about policies, processes, and standards, checking internally on those processes, what we want to give to our auditors, where that result is going to be. really what our risk level is, and hopefully get to a point where we can get those really exceptional results when the auditors come in. And again, go through that life cycle again and again, but this time instead of spreadsheets and Word documents and, Bob, who's a single point of failure that unfortunately goes on leave for an extended period, may have the access to all of those successes and remediation plans, and now you can't get in and look at them when the auditors come in. I mean, there's 1,000,001 scenarios operationally. So if you're lucky enough to have ServiceNow as a tool within your company, you can go ahead and load up a lot of these pieces and have a better view of what, of really how well your company is doing. And that's all I have, folks.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Karina. Very, very informative. I do have a few questions showing up in the dashboard here, so we'll get to them just in a second. As a reminder, please use the question section to ask a question on today's topic. So first question, Karina, what's a typical implementation timeline?
Oh boy, I wish I had a canned answer for that one, but I really don't. All clients are different, different sizes, different scopes, different timelines and needs. So I can't give a timeline for that one because I'd really have to understand how big is the company that we're talking about and really what do they want out of their GRC program. So it's a very tailored thing to try to answer.
Okay.
Well, call us.
That makes total sense. We can respond back to that person privately. Okay, good. Next question. We have some policies that contain 10 to 15 policy statements. Is that standard, or are we too granular in how we are creating our policy statements?
And again, that's, I'd hate to say, yes, that's too many, or that's just really not enough without really taking a look at the size of the company, their level of regulations that they have in their company, and what type, really what they want out of their GRC program. So that's another one where I'm going to have to ask people to give us a call because I just can't answer that one blanketly.
Okay. All right. How would you recommend setting up profile types based on what is seen in industry? For example, business process plus location, etc., especially so that audit can use later to scope their audits.
Wow, that was a mouthful. I'm sorry. Can we take that one piece at a time? So let's talk about profile types really quickly. So profile types are one of those things that you again need to decide on for whether or not you want to apply controls to your profile types. So the most important thing is identifying your data sets. So NIST standards has guidance on data in rest and data in transit. And it's very important to understand your classifications and establish your classifications. What you really want to do is hone in on the pieces of your infrastructure that contain those critical pieces of information that you want to secure really carefully.
Okay, so the first part of the question, really the second part was just an example. So how would you recommend setting up profile types based on what is seen in industry? For example, business process plus location, especially so that audit can use later to scope their audit. So I think, yeah, okay, I think you've answered that question. Good stuff. How often should we be reviewing our controls to ensure they are still relevant?
So some people do annually, Some people do quarterly. Really what's going to give you the answer to that is how fluid is my environment? How frequently do things change? And again, I hate to answer this way, but it really is up to every single company to establish their own processes within the policies for those update and review cycles.
And this is Marcus. On those controls, you can also decide, some of them can go annually, some of them can go quarterly, so you can kind of segregate it out based off of how often a particular control might change or the criteria for that control.
Perfect, thanks.
Excellent, thanks. Thanks you too. Do you have any advice on how to break up implementation to small manageable pieces to best avoid rework but increase time to value?
Again, I would really prioritize on, so I guess I'm going to go back to really recommending data classification. So, well, maybe not data classification. You want data classified, but you want to make sure that your operations are classified from a criticality perspective. So let's talk about that same data set that holds your general ledger information, right? You want to make sure that you can prioritize your GRC implementation to focus on the most important parts of your infrastructure, whether that's a process, whether that's a business system. For instance, if you have SAP financials, you want to make sure that your SAP financials and everything that falls in that business service, your mid servers, your hardware, your applications, your assets, your groups, everything that falls into that business system that rolls up to that business service, that is stood up first before, for instance, your, I don't know, the menu for your cafeteria, right? And what they're going to be serving in the next 3 weeks. I mean, those are processes, operational processes and data sets. But one data set is way more important than the other. So really the best thing to do is hone in on the stuff that's most critical to your company.
Okay. Excellent. We have a question if there will be a copy of the recording of the presentation. There will be, and it will be on our website. So I was able to answer a question today. So that looks like that's it. So if anyone requires any additional information, please reach out to us through our website, www.alcor.com. And there will be a recording of today's webinar available on that website and through our social media sites. So thanks everyone for joining. See you at the next webinar.